Hi Celtics. We're just going to do a quick lesson about the term Christology. Christology is the term that theologians use to talk about the way that we study Jesus, who he was, what he did during his lifetime. Was he God? Did he claim to be God? Was he divine or not divine? So there are a lot of different people who would answer those questions in different ways. Of course, the church has its own way of answering those questions. So one of the things we talk about is a high Christology versus a low Christology. High Christology means that you have a tendency when you look at Jesus to focus on his divinity rather than his humanity. So a high Christology tends to focus on the more powerful side of Jesus, his miracles, Jesus as the Word of God, Jesus as a part of the Trinity. A low Christology tends to focus more on the human side of Jesus, so the more human experiences that he went through. Laughter, friendship, struggling, suffering, temptation, all of those things that are part of what it means to be a human being. So it's not that either one of these is good or bad. They're both good because they're both right. Jesus was human and he was divine. But it's more about which one you have a tendency to focus on. One of the ways that I think it's helpful to sort of talk about high Christology or low Christology is looking at artwork. You can see in these two examples that we have, let me just get my pen here, what I would call a picture that has a tendency here on the left to focus on a low Christology. This is a very humanizing picture of Jesus. He's laughing. He almost looks like one of his friends just told a really good joke, right? So this is kind of a very human side of Jesus, as opposed to the picture on the right here, which I would say is probably more of a low Christology, or a high Christology. We have, Jesus wearing a crown. He's sitting on a throne. He's making this classic hand gesture with the three fingers. That's a reference to his part in the Holy Trinity. He's wearing clothing that literally no poor man would have ever worn at the time that he was actually alive. Jesus would have never worn anything like this. So this is more of an icon from the Byzantine era that's focusing on the divine side of Jesus rather than his actual human experience as a person on earth. One thing that's sort of interesting is that if you start to look at artwork of Jesus from different cultures and different places around the world, you start to see that Jesus has a tendency to look more or less like the people, the dress, hair color, the setting, that kind of thing, of the people that created the artwork. We have a tendency to like to imagine Jesus looking like we do, right? So in this image from 1879 from China, the disciples and the rich man are all wearing clothing that's very similar to that traditional Chinese clothing. There's bamboo in the background. In this other picture, we have a much more modern interpretation of Jesus from an American community that is an African American community. And you can see that it's a sort of distinctly unique perspective of Jesus that is very meaningful to people within the African American community of Jesus Christ the Liberator, right? And you can imagine for a people who have a history of having been enslaved, why imaging Jesus as a liberator would have been so important to that community. When you look at, for example, this image of Jesus on the left, this is an image that me, as a white American, probably would have grown up being something very comfortable with, this image. It would have been a part of the way that I imagined Jesus would have looked when I was a child. But you'll notice in the image that Jesus has very light skin, he has blondish hair, he has blue eyes. It is extremely unlikely that Jesus would have actually looked anything like this, but that is an image that myself as a white person probably would have been pretty comfortable with. This is an image of Jesus where he looked like me, right? The one on the right was actually created for a magazine, Popular Science, by a scientist, an anthropologist, who studied the data of skull shape, body shape, hair color, eye color, skin color of people in the first century in Palestine, and this is the rendering of what he thinks the average guy would have looked like around the time of Jesus. So that picture on the right, which is probably not as much one that I would have grown up seeing Jesus look like that, is probably much more accurate of an image of Jesus than the one that I would have grown up with here on the left. This one's probably way closer to what he actually looked like. So your assignment is going to have you look at some different images of Jesus and ask that question, why do we imagine Jesus looking